In this lecture, we will examine geography of race and racism. This is important to geographers because of how people around the world have been classified and subsequently discriminated against based on these artificial categories. In addition, this will give us the foundation of spatial inclusion and exclusion by considering two basic principles about identity. One, human identity is dynamic and contingent and therefore cannot be easily categorized. Two, efforts to classify people into groups tend to exaggerate the differences among people, especially visible differences. Race refers to our genetic makeup that can be used to identify distinctive and exclusive categories of people. Race can be a highly contested idea and was developed over time. It was determined that basically four groups of people initially lived on Earth. These categories, coined in a naming scheme in the 18th century, were African, American as in native peoples, Asiatic, and European, and were basically determined by skin color, which varied by geographical region. However, these categories were general and that physical attributes could change gradually over space. Plus, it was determined that physical traits did not have the same spatial distribution. Therefore, these racial categories are subjective and arbitrary and have no geographical or biological basis. With this in mind, race was best thought of as a social construction, which is an idea or a phenomena that does not exist in nature but is created and given meaning by people. A good example of the subjectiveness is of President Obama as shown in the photo. His mother was white of European descent and his father was black of African descent. Children born to interracial couples often come to know that race is a social construction. From first-hand experiences, they learn that people, including their own friends, applied different racial identities to them. Some people construct his racial identity as biracial, while others construct it as black, simply based on the color of his skin. Racism, therefore, is the intolerance of people perceived to be inherently or genetically inferior, which builds a hierarchy of peoples from the most superior to the most inferior. Racism can also be thought of as an ideology that has been exploited by certain groups. An ideology is a system of ideas, beliefs, and values that justify the views, practices, or orientation of a group. The idea of racism was most influentially shaped by the theory of the Great Chain of Being, as depicted in the photo. This ideology developed during the European Age of Enlightenment period in the late 17th and 18th centuries. The Great Chain of Being is based on the idea that there is a natural and ranked order of life in the world, and therefore this helped Europeans make sense of their world, including ranking classes of people in that hierarchy, white being at the top. Visible differences, including skin color, were used to distinguish among different ranks and races of people. This far-reaching legacy can be summarized in three following points. 1. The concept was seen as a natural phenomena, not a social construction. 2. It emphasized the difference between people and drew upon those differences to explain genetic and intellectual inferiority and inequality. And 3. Whiteness then became a standard of measure. During the era of European imperialism, this ideology of racism diffused widely and was used not only to justify European dominance and colonization, but also to reinforce European power. The ideology of racism supported the idea that social inequality was a natural phenomenon and that the place for whites was at the top of the social hierarchy. Racism was seen most notably in the transatlantic slave trade during European colonization, which reinforced European power. The enslavement of people perceived to be of low status or class is an ancient practice known to have existed in many societies around the world. Only in the Americas, however, did a form of slavery so strongly based on visible physical difference emerge. Even though slavery is illegal today, it still persists as one kind of human trafficking, in which people are forcibly and or fraudulently recruited for work in exploitive conditions, for example, as child soldiers or prostitutes. Human trafficking has been called the underside of globalization. The map on the right shows the generalized transatlantic slave routes from the 16th and 18th centuries. Brazil and the Caribbean were the leading destinations of African slaves. Two factors that sustained the trade were strong demand for labor in the Americas and the increasingly common view that racial categories were natural. The photo on the bottom left shows a young girl in India as a bonded laborer in a brick-making factory. Bonded labor is common when the employer has a long-term lease for your services because of a debt owed by the family, which could have passed down from a previous generation, creating a vicious cycle of debt slavery. The top left pie chart shows the estimated percentages of forced laborers by region as of 2005. Note the high number of people from Asia due in part to the enduring systems of bonded labor. Workers are recruited with the promise of high wages, but once employed, those promises are broken and laborers are forced to work with threats of penalty or of harm. Please pause the video and answer the following. How did racism become an ideology, and how can it contribute to human trafficking? In your own words, using the text as a guide, be thorough and specific with your answer.